HDR versus SDR, what's the difference? With HDR increasing in popularity, you are probably wondering how it compares to the original SDR standard. HDR technology is now so widespread that popular streaming services such as Amazon Prime, Disney Plus, and Netflix have started to support HDR content. In fact, if you were to look for a new TV or monitor today, you'd be surprised how almost every product boasts HDR on its spec list. Which begs the question, what is HDR exactly? How does HDR work, and how does it compare to regular SDR? What is SDR? The Standard Dynamic Range, SDR, is a video standard that has been in use since CRT monitors. Despite the market success of HDR screen technology, SDR is still the default format used in TVs, monitors, and projectors. Although it was used in old CRT monitors, and is actually hampered by the limitations of CRT technology, SDR is still an acceptable format today. In fact, the vast majority of video content, whether games, movies, or YouTube videos, still uses SDR. Basically, if the device or content is not rated as HDR, you are probably using SDR. What is HDR? High Dynamic Range, HDR, is the newer standard in images and videos. HDR first became popular among photographers wanting to properly expose a composition with two subjects having a 13-stop difference in exposure value. Such a wide dynamic range would allow proper exposure to real-life scenes that previously weren't possible with SDR. More recently, HDR was introduced to movies, videos, and even games. While SDR content provided overblown skies, indistinguishable blacks, and banding problems during high-contrast scenes, HDR realistically portrays these scenes with a more expansive color space, color depth, and luminance. Broader color space, bigger color depth, and higher luminance make HDR better than SDR, but by how much? Pros and cons of HDR and SDR. HDR and SDR are two standards used in visual digital media. Using one standard from another will have its strengths and weaknesses. Here is a table to show you how one compares with the other. In terms of color and display, HDR is better than SDR in every way. It provides significant improvements in color space, luminance, and color depth. So, if you have the chance to watch movies, view images, or play games in HDR, you should always do so, but can you? The problem with HDR is that most consumable media is not HDR compatible. Often, viewing HDR media on an SDR screen will make your viewing experience worse than watching it on a regular SDR panel. Another problem is that most HDR devices use HDR10, which is loosely standardized, while its marketing is largely uniform. For example, you'll find the HDR10 logo slapped on a subpar panel that cannot perform as well as the 1000 nits panel shown in HDR10 advertisements. Although SDR provides the usual viewing standards and cannot compete with HDR when it does work, its ease of use, compatibility, and lower cost is why many people still prefer using it. You need both HDR and SDR. Now that you know the difference between SDR and HDR standards, it becomes obvious that HDR is the clear winner when it comes to watching entertaining content. This, however, does not mean that you should stop using SDR. The truth is that SDR is still the better standard to use whenever you are not watching or playing HDR-specific content. If you are buying a new display, it would be wise to invest in a more expensive HDR-capable panel as it allows you to watch both HDR and SDR content. Since SDR content looks bad in HDR10, you can always turn off HDR when you are watching, playing, or viewing SDR content and applications. Hopefully, that gives you an idea of how much of an impact HDR brings to the table. Although SDR is still going to be the way you enjoy various content, it is only a matter of time until HDR gets better support. Then, it will likely be the future standard everybody uses.